Hello everyone and welcome to Ethics. I am Professor Rogers, and in this video I wanted to give a kind of a brief overview of some of the information, kind of giving you an idea quickly about where we're headed this semester, and then also a little bit of information about how the class is going to work, and mostly in that situation really just about a couple of the assignments, because I know that you'll be concerned about how you're going to earn your grade in this class. And so I want to give you a couple of bits of information that will hopefully let you know a little bit about how it's going to work, and then a couple of tips for a couple of the assignments as well that are going to be pretty important. I found for my students that to make sure that you understand them and make sure that you use those tips as you start trying to complete those assignments. So first of all, a little bit about ethics. Ethics is a branch of philosophy, and it's one of the main branches of the study of philosophy, and there are really 5 main branches of philosophy. I don't want to go into the other 4 today, but just so you know that this is one of the pieces, it's one of the strands of that particular line of inquiry, that particular line of study. And I teach Introduction to Philosophy as well. And in that Introduction to Philosophy class, we focus on 3 of the branches, really. What does it mean to be human? How should humans behave? And then how should humans be governed a little bit as well. But in this class, we're going to mostly be focused on how should humans behave, which just is the question of ethics, or I'll use the word moral choices as well, morality. And so I'll kind of use ethics and morality interchangeably as well. We'll have to do a little bit of other types of thinking as well, kind of quickly. We'll have to talk a little bit about what does it mean to be human, like most importantly, what does it mean to be self-aware, and then kind of some quick discussion on things like free will as well, because that's going to be some major, those are going to be really, really important when it comes to having discussions of moral thinking. And so we'll do some quick philosophy in there as well, but mostly and eventually we're going to really get into the question of morality itself. We're going to start out by asking the question, what is it that makes a problem moral, or what is it that makes a decision a moral decision, as opposed to just a decision like, you know, deciding what shirt to wear. That's not a moral problem. So what is it specifically that makes a question a moral question? We're also going to have to start out by doing a little bit of basic logic. I'm not going to get too heavily into that, but there are some rules that we're going to need to cover really rather quickly. In order for us to be able to move forward in our thinking, we have to partially begin by thinking about right thinking, and so we'll have to do some quick logic as well. After we do that, and there'll only be a couple of 2 or 3 lectures on those topics, and after we do that, we're going to move into something called worldviews. And when you study a worldview, you're really just studying somebody's outlook on life, the way they view the world itself, and we'll get into more detail about worldviews. Some of the worldviews in particular that we'll look at, and then why they matter. Like, what is it that's so important about a worldview when it comes to making moral choices? And so hopefully as we study those worldviews, it's going to be really important that you begin to understand and to see why other people think the way they think. That's one of the main goals of this class for me. One of the things I don't do is I don't tell my students what to think. Often I try to help them as they're thinking, but that doesn't mean that I tell them, and you should think this or you should believe this. That's not my job. But certainly I want to ask good questions. If you believe this thing here, do you have good reasons for believing it? And if you do, then even if I disagree with your position, at least you have good reasons for believing what you believe. And that's really one of the main goals of the class, is to help you see why you believe what you believe. But again, also to help you to understand why other people believe what they believe. Why is it that they think the way that they do? And by studying worldviews, we can come to understand other people and why they think what they think much, much more easily. And what it'll do is it'll help to broaden your horizons. Again, not telling you what to think, but it will just at least help you to understand why they're doing what they're doing. So once you start understanding worldviews, it helps you to understand people, most importantly, that you disagree with. At least you can understand why they think what they think, and that's going to be really important. So two of those goals: understanding why you think what you think, and then also trying to understand why other people think the way they do and think what they do. After we get done with worldviews, we're going to start looking at moral theories in particular. And a moral theory, sometimes I call them an ethical engine, or something like that. The idea behind the moral theories or the ethical engines is that it's a process that tries to help people to distinguish what they should do in a given situation. So if you're in a certain scenario, then how ought you to behave? And a moral theory is a kind of a set of guidelines or tools that will guide an individual as they're trying to make a moral choice. And so what we need to do is we need to take apart several of those moral theories and try to understand what it is that these individuals are saying to us when they're saying use these principles for making moral thoughts, for making moral decisions. And so, for example, in utilitarianism, John Stuart Mill is going to say that something is moral or immoral based on the fact of that it brings either a greater amount of pleasure or a greater amount of pain to a greater number of people. And we'll go into quite a bit of detail later, so I'm not going to now. But just so you can kind of see, he's saying when it comes to moral choices, do this is the right thing to do if it brings a greater amount of pleasure to a greater number of persons. Or it's the wrong thing to do if it brings a greater amount of pain to a greater number of persons. And it's much, much more in depth than that, and we'll take a good long look at utilitarianism for sure. But you can kind of see how they're trying to set up a guideline of, and use these things here in order to determine how you ought to behave in a given scenario. And we're going to look at 7 or 8, I think, of those different moral theories. And one of the most important things to understand about moral theories is that even if you disagree with the moral theory and the position that they take, just thinking about these things that some of these great thinkers have come up with, just thinking about them can help you to understand why it is that you're making the moral choices that you are. What's your criteria? Why are you deciding that these things are morally right and these things are morally wrong? And so in thinking about this, you'll come to understand your own thinking, hopefully even better. And again, hopefully you'll begin to understand other person's thinking as well. And so quickly too, with moral theories, and we'll talk about this again later, none of them are without weakness. All of them have some kind of problem where, yes, they might work really well in this scenario, but here's a scenario where maybe they're not going to work quite so well. And so if we just had one moral theory that just solved all problems, maybe we wouldn't need a college class on that particular topic. But we don't have that. We don't have that one argument or that one theory that just wins in all scenarios. They all have problems, and so we'll look at all of the problems that they have. But I think that all of the ones that we're going to be looking at have something to offer. Again, it can help us to think about moral choices, not just when we're making them, but what exactly moral choices are, and how perhaps, what kind of guidelines that we should have to help us make those choices. Once we talk about the moral theories, I'd like to try to outline for you some moral scenarios as well. And in those moral scenarios, trying to get you to make moral choices and perhaps even defend why you think this is morally the right thing to do, or morally this is the wrong thing to do. This is something that I do quite a bit in my classes when I'm standing in the physical classroom with my students. It's much easier, and we have a dialogue where I play devil's advocate, and they'll say, these things are right or wrong, and I'll try to stump them, and I'll try to make them think about, well, what about this, and what about this, and what about these consequences? That's really difficult to do in an online class, and so we won't do nearly as much of that as I get to do in my classrooms. But hopefully I'll give you a couple of them that you can think about on your own, and perhaps even engage with some of your some of your friends or your family or someone else to think about and think through these moral scenarios and why you should or shouldn't act in this way or that way. Again, it's just not as conducive here online as it is in a classroom, so we won't do quite so much of that, but I do want to try to give you a few things toward the end, so some of those moral scenarios if we can. All right, and now what you actually care about, right? I've kind of previewed the class for you, but what you really want to know is, what do I have to do to pass this class? How am I going to make my grade? And your grade is going to be determined largely by quizzes. And what I have set up right now is that there'll be a video. Sometimes it'll be me doing a lecture. Sometimes it's a quick video that I found online. That's a kind of an introduction. They do a really kind of quick, like 15-minute video. They give you a really, good, quick overview of, say, utilitarianism, for example. And what that does is that it kind of gives you an introduction. You have a basic idea. I do a little bit more in depth, a little bit more discussion in my lectures then. And there might be a quiz, say, on that video, and then a quiz on my lecture, and then sticking with utilitarianism. Then I might give like a biography of John Stuart Mill, one of the most important persons to write on utilitarianism. And maybe I'll give you his bio, and then there'll be like a 10-question quiz on that. My quizzes tend to be about 10 questions long. 1 point per question tends to be kind of where I land as well. Mostly it's going to be fill in the blank, and I'm pretty... I keep on the closed caption online when I'm making the quizzes so that I can try to stay as close to the exact wording as I can. So if I'm giving a lecture and then I make a quiz on it, I'm reading what I'm saying, and then I try to build the fill-in-the-blank questions as precisely from what I have said as I can. I can't always do that. Sometimes I want to make sure that you've seen a certain part of the video and that you've understood it, and so what I'll do is I'll take 4 or 5 sentences and I'll cram them into one, and I'll make you kind of pull out what I'm looking for from that. Most of the time I stick with the exact wording, but sometimes I want you to give me concept. I want you to be able to say, here's what you meant. Can you pull the meaning out from multiple sentences? And so probably still fill in the blank. Sometimes true false. I'm not a big fan of true false because you can just guess. And so most of the time it's going to be some kind of fill in the blank. On the quizzes, you'll always have the opportunity to do them twice, and this does a couple of things. If you accidentally submit, and my students do that sometimes, then you've got another shot. And I don't have to go back in, and you don't have to contact me, and we don't have to play tag for a while until I can get it set up for you again. But it also allows that you can go in and make mistakes. And the computer is going to be a computer. It doesn't understand when you get close. So if I have a fill in the blank and a fill in the blank question, and you come in and you misspell the answer, the computer doesn't know that you got close. It doesn't know that, hey, you really understood this, because it can only be precise. And I try to cut that off. I try to make sure that I'm giving answers with, say, multiple spellings. Say, for example, if the answer to a word is free will, I might spell it free will, all one word, and then I might make the answer free will, free space will, and then free dash will. I try to come up with those types of things where my students automatically get credit, again, so we don't have to try to play tag and email and, hey, I did answer this correctly, right? So be sure that you're being careful with your spelling. Try to spell things precisely as possible, and that way you'll go ahead and get credit for it immediately. I do go back, especially at the end of the semester, and check to make sure that if any of my students, say if you're 15 points from going up a letter grade from a B, say, to an A, I'll go back through all of your assignments and see if there are some points out there that you should have gotten credit for. Say, again, utilitarianism can be a tougher one to spell, and so if you went in and it's obvious you said utilitarianism, I'll just force the computer to accept that answer, and you'll get credit for it. But best to just try and make sure you spell everything and do everything correctly that first time. And so you do have multiple attempts at the quizzes. You will not have multiple attempts at the final exam. You'll only have one attempt on the final exam, so you want to be really, really careful with that. As far as, also I do essays. Not a lot of them, but in some of the most important lectures, I will ask you to write an essay. And an essay for me is somewhere between 8 and 12 sentences long. So it's not a really, really large one. It's something you can, put up on a Word document, or there's an area in Blackboard that you can submit it. But 8 to 12 sentences long. What I want you to do is to take the lecture and explain it back to me. And so pretend like I don't know anything about the topic. We're sticking with utilitarianism. Pretend like I don't know anything about utilitarianism, and then using what I told you in the lecture, tell me what I told you as if I know absolutely nothing about utilitarianism. And so 8 to 12 sentences, and then explain the lecture back to me as if I don't know anything about that particular topic. One thing you can do that's actually really helpful for some of my students, if you have time, is to explain utilitarianism to someone who does not know anything about utilitarianism. And then if they're asking you questions, then you can add a little bit to your essay because, hey, they don't know anything about it. And so when you put it in there, then it makes sense. And so if you have someone who is particularly patient and particularly wonderful, who you can say, email it to, and then have them email it back to you, yes, this is good, no, it's not. That's always helpful as well. A couple of really, really important rules, ones that I'm really, really picky about when it comes to essays, two of them. Number one, don't say I. In these essays, it really, in this case, isn't about what you think or what you believe or what you got out of it, right? So don't say things like, one of the things I really liked about this particular lecture, don't do that, right? I just want the content. What we're looking for here is that you understand the concepts of what I'm trying to get you to understand. So focus on the concepts, focus on the big concepts, the ones that I spend a lot of time on, but don't say I, right? And so what it's going to do is it's going to remove it's going to remove from you your opinion, because what will happen is that if I let you say I, then you'll sit there and you'll give mostly your opinion about that lecture or about that particular topic. And we're not ready for that yet. That's not something that I'm wanting from you yet, because what I want from you first and foremost is that you understand the concepts. Until you understand a concept, then your opinion about the concept really doesn't matter. And that's a little bit rude, but it doesn't. So why doesn't it matter? Because if you misunderstand a concept, if you don't understand what's happening, then your opinion about that concept could definitely be wrong because you don't fully understand it. So I need to make sure that you do understand the concept of utilitarianism before I worry about your opinion of utilitarianism. So no opinions, just give me the information back, just give me the content back, and so then we'll worry later about what you actually think about utilitarianism. The second important rule with the essays, no examples. And I take away examples because examples are not content. Again, I want you to give me the concept back. And so what will happen is, if I let you use examples, most people will say utilitarianism focuses on pleasure, play, blah, 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 blah. One or two sentences like that about concept, and then what they'll do is they'll say, for example, and then they'll spend the rest of the essay on some kind of example. So no examples. I want content of concept. That's what is really, really important for you to give to me in these essays. If you say I'll send it back to you and say, try again. And I mean, it's a 0. But don't let that worry you, because lots of my students, they'll mess up. And then I send it back. They go in, they erase that, they put something else in. Or they'll get in there, they'll get to typing, and for example, sometimes they won't even say for example, but they use an example. And so I'll send it back to them, and that's a 0. There's not a 2 limit turn in on the essays. I'll let you turn those in multiple times because they are a little bit harder, and I found that most of my students haven't really had to engage in this type of writing before. And so I expect that the first few times that you turn something like this in, it's going to be really difficult for you. It is for the majority of my students. So if that's you, I mean, you're par, you're normal. So don't worry about it. And you can still get the full 25 points. There's no, you know, I'm not going to do anything like first time you could get 25, second time 20, third time. I'm not doing that. If you write a good essay, it's worth 25 points. Doesn't matter how many times you turned it in. Once you get it right, you got it right. And so 25 points will still be available to you each time you turn it in. But certainly you want to turn it in once and get the 25 points and go on down the road. So that's a little bit about the essays. Okay. All right, so that's a little bit about the class. That's a little bit about how and where your grade is going to come from as well. For grading purposes, what I'll do, I'm making some pretty big changes to the class right now, and so I don't know exactly the number of points that will be available in the class. My guess is it's going to be around 700. And so what I'll do is just say that you know, an A is like 630 points. I think it's something like that. So if you make 630 out of the 700 points, that's an A. Or if you get to 560, I think, is a B. I think that's right. That's 80% of the points that are available in the class. If you make it to that point total, then that's a B. And what this will let you do as you move throughout the semester is you'll be able to see, you'll be able to track for yourself exactly where you are, because I'll try to give those numbers. And like I say, I'm making some changes, so I don't know the ultimate number at this point, so I may not be able to give you the totals exactly, but I'm guessing it's around 700 at this point. So if you earn that many points, you'll be able to track how many points you earn as you move throughout the semester, and then you'll kind of have an idea. And so if you're looking to make a C in the class, then when you get to, you know, whatever number that is, you'll know exactly where you are, how much you need when you get closer to the end, depending on whatever grade it is that you're trying to make. So that's kind of how I don't do the I mean, it's still A, B, C. It's still grading like that, but I just do numbers because it lets my students track themselves much more easily. Okay. And so that's a little bit about some of the information in the class. That's a little bit about some of how the class works, where your grade comes from. But then here I wanted to close with this last bit of encouragement for you as we start this class. One of the most difficult things I've found for myself and I've found for other people is trying to keep an open mind. I don't know how many times you've probably heard this in your life about trying to be open-minded, and I think that's important. Now, I also think it's important that you're not so open-minded that your brain just falls out on the floor. There's more to being open-minded doesn't mean that you have to accept everything that's told to you. It just means that you listen to new ideas and to different views that are different from your own, and that you try to understand them before you dismiss them, or before you say, I just disagree and no longer listen to it. So I really encourage you in this class to listen to the ideas that are going to be presented. Again, not because I want you to agree with me in the end. That makes no difference to me, and your grade is certainly not going to be determined on the fact that you agree or disagree with me. I don't think that's the right way to handle a college class. But I think the right way to handle a class from the professor's perspective is to challenge you, is to try to challenge your thinking in a field like this, in a field of study like morality. I think it is important to try to bring to you ideas that perhaps you're not familiar with. I expect that we'll bump into several different concepts or several different moral theories that you've not heard of, or that you've not looked at in any kind of depth. And then hopefully in studying those things, you'll keep an open mind as you study them, so that you can understand the concept as best you can, and then decide if it's something that you need to incorporate into your own thinking, or if it's something that you can go ahead and dismiss. But hopefully you'll be able to keep an open mind. One of the reasons it's so hard to keep an open mind is because humans don't like to admit that they're wrong. Don't you know that person who you can prove to them that they're wrong, and even with all the evidence that's staring them right in the face, they will fight to the bitter end that know that they're not wrong. And it's really kind of silly, and sometimes it's off-putting as well. And so rather than taking that approach, rather than kind of demanding that, no, what I think is true and right, what I encourage you to do is to take more of a position of, you have been wrong in the past. Now, I can say that because I know I've been wrong in the past, and everyone I know, everyone I've ever met, has admitted that they have made mistakes in their thinking and that they've had to change their mind. Again, changing your mind is a really, really difficult thing to do. I know, I've done it. And so, I sympathize with you. I understand that it's difficult to admit when you're wrong. It is difficult to change your mind, especially on really big questions, because if you change your mind on a big question and the answer to that big question, then you have to change some of the most fundamental, some of the most basic foundational ideas that you've got. And this is what we're going to get into when we start talking about worldviews. You have to change some of those things perhaps that you rely on, that you've always stood on. Like a house stands on a foundation, you stand on these basic things that you think are true. And if those things start moving around, it can make you more than just uncomfortable. It can really rattle your world. Again, I know that's the case because I've had my own world rattled multiple times throughout my life. And the more I study and the more I've traveled and the more I've met people who have different worldviews, and even the more I've looked at history and studied history and the history of thinking as well, I've really been challenged to as I've begin to understand the way people in the ancient world thought and in the more modern world thought and now in our postmodern world, as I begin to understand these things and as I begin to see them more clearly, it challenges my way of thinking, and I constantly have to continue thinking about my own thinking. Why do you think what you think? Why do you believe what you believe? And so I internalize all of this as well. So I would encourage you that to take that approach, to try to be open-minded. And lots of people say, almost everybody says they're open-minded, and in truth, most people aren't open-minded. It's a difficult thing to do. It's difficult to take those new ideas and understand them and then figure out if you should change your concepts of the world or not. It's very uncomfortable, and it can disrupt your life. That is certainly the case. And so I understand why it's difficult, but I would encourage you to go ahead and take on that particular mindset as you move through the class. Hopefully the class will be challenging enough that you will engage with new ideas, things that perhaps you've never heard or never really thought through fully and completely, so that you won't just come in and answer the questions and leave and that'll be that. Hopefully it'll be a little bit more engaging and a little bit more applicable. I want this to be something that you can apply to yourself and that you can apply to your life as well. Not just studying a bunch of theories, but something that actually engages you in life and in the world where you live and breathe and find your existence. And so as we move forward, hopefully those things will be part of this class. All right, as I said, just kind of a brief introduction, a brief overview of where we're headed, a little bit about several of the things that I think you should know, and then in that next lecture we'll start talking about what does it mean for a question or a problem to be a moral question. And I'm looking forward to a semester with you here in this ethics class. We'll see you next time.